The wind cut across the riverbank like a blade. Mud sucked at their boots as German female POWs were lined up under the gray March sky of 1945. A U.S. sergeant's voice cracked through the air. "Strip, now." No one moved. The women's breaths came out in white bursts of fog. Some still wore Luftwaffe auxiliary armbands, others field. Gray skirts torn from retreat. They had been captured outside Remagen just days after the bridge fell. And now, instead of interrogation, came this. An order that made no sense. A whistle blew. Helmets gleamed under thin sunlight. The guards watched as the women hesitated, their faces a mix of defiance and disbelief. "Public bath," the interpreter muttered, almost apologetically. The phrase traveled down the line like a sickness. Someone laughed nervously, and the sound shattered whatever dignity still lingered. Steam rose from tin buckets nearby, but the water was ice, cold from the Rhine. Ingrid, a former radio operator, clenched her fists so hard her nails cut skin. Her mind flashed to her training barracks. Strict, orderly, predictable. Now chaos, she whispered, "They want to break us." The woman beside her, a nurse, replied flatly, "They already have." Behind the barbed wire, a group of young American GIs shifted uneasily. Most had never seen enemy women up close. Orders were orders, but this didn't feel like victory. Every detail stuck in the mind, the hiss of canvas tents, the stink of damp uniforms piled for delousing, the click of rifle bolts resetting out of habit. Somewhere, a truck engine coughed to life, drowning out a woman's sob. According to U.S. Army field reports, more than 500,000 German women served in support roles: radio, transport, medical, clerical. Now many stood here, stripped of uniform, name, and command. For them, defeat wasn't just military, it was personal, flesh-deep. Ingrid's trembling hands reached for her belt buckle as the guards turned away or pretended to. Shame radiated heavier than the cold. One soldier muttered under his breath, "This ain't right." His voice disappeared in the wind. Somewhere down the line, boots shuffled, fabric fell, and the sound of the river grew louder. Ingrid's eyes lifted once, to the guard tower silhouetted against the fading sky, and then down again. The next command echoed, closer this time. It was only the beginning. They stood barefoot in the mud, the river whispering cold promises at their feet. The order came again, into the water, and the first woman stepped forward. The Rhine's current bit her skin like glass. She gasped, stumbled, then went under to her knees. Behind her, the line of German female POW stretched like a broken spine across the gray morning. Their breath steamed in the air as American guards watched from a distance, rifles slung, eyes unreadable. It was supposed to be a hygiene measure, a public bath before new uniforms were issued, but it didn't feel like cleanliness. It felt like exposure. Each splash echoed through the camp, cutting through the hum of trucks and the clang of metal buckets. Steam rose where sunlight met cold river water, creating a fog that blurred faces into ghostly outlines. Some women moved like machines, others froze mid-step, clutching what dignity they could. One shouted in defiance, "We are not animals." A guard barked back, "Orders." That single word was the only law left here. According to camp rosters, 83 women were processed that morning, temperatures barely above 10 degrees Celsius. Reports later described it clinically, delousing and sanitation completed, no incidents, but the faces told a different story, cheeks red from cold, eyes hollow from shame. Ingrid kept her gaze on the water, refusing to meet the soldier's eyes. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Around her, the sound of fabric tearing, metal tags clinking, and boots sinking deep into the sludge became an eerie rhythm. "It isn't water," one woman whispered, "it's humiliation." From the watchtower, Private Collins shifted uncomfortably. He was 19, from Ohio, and had joined the army to see Europe. He wasn't expecting this. The sergeant beside him spat into the dirt, muttering, "Just do your damn job." But even he couldn't look for long. For some, the war had ended. For others, it had just changed shape. When Ingrid finally stepped back onto the bank, her skin burning and her body shaking, her eyes caught the faintest sign of mercy, a guard lowering his rifle, turning away. For a brief moment, she thought humanity might still exist inside the uniform, but that hope would be tested sooner than she imagined. Private Collins couldn't shake the sound of that splash. The river still hissed behind him as the women stumbled out, their bodies trembling, eyes fixed on nothing. He rubbed his palms on his uniform, trying to scrub away the guilt. "Orders are orders," the sergeant kept saying. But even that mantra was starting to sound like a lie. The camp at Remagen was chaos, too many prisoners, too few supplies, and no real protocol for handling women. The brass wanted efficiency. The men on the ground were improvising. Collins glanced at his friend, Private Harris, who was only 18, barely shaving, his face twisted between pity and duty. "This ain't what I signed up for," Harris whispered. Collins replied, "None of us did." Laughter drifted from a group of soldiers near the trucks, forced, brittle, wrong. Some were masking discomfort, others were numbing it. Every man found his own way to survive the sight of women lined up under orders that made sense only on paper. In his pocket, Collins carried a letter from home, his sister's handwriting. For the first time, he couldn't bring himself to read it. According to field manuals, captured personnel were to be treated with respect and humanity, but the manuals didn't prepare them for this. The average GI in 1945 was 19 years old, most with no combat psychology training. They had been told the Germans were monsters. Seeing them cold, terrified, and human, especially women, broke that illusion. Ingrid noticed Collins turning away when she struggled to pull her blanket tight. That small act of decency burned in her mind more than the cold. She whispered to herself. Some turned their faces, others didn't. As evening approached, the camp smelled of damp wool and kerosene. Fires flickered weakly, and the sound of boots crunching over gravel replaced the laughter. The day's bathing had ended, but shame lingered like smoke. Collins couldn't meet anyone's eyes, not the prisoners, not his own reflection in the water barrel. Then, as he passed the line of shivering women, he did something reckless. He tossed a towel toward Ingrid. She caught it mid-air, eyes locking with his for a heartbeat. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something human. And that human flicker wouldn't go unnoticed. The towel in Ingrid's hands was still damp, smelling faintly of diesel and soap. Around her, the women huddled close, steam rising off their skin like smoke from a dying fire. The Rhine stretched behind them, wide, gray, and merciless. The order had been clear, all clothing to be burned, delousing protocol. The guards tossed uniforms into a barrel, one after another. The flames swallowed wool and leather until only the stink of scorched fabric remained. Someone screamed when the first gust of cold air hit. The wind off the river cut straight to the bone. Ingrid wrapped her arms around herself, her breath shaking. "Why burn our clothes?" she whispered. A nurse beside her answered softly, "They want control, not cleanliness." When the women were herded back toward the water for final rinse, the cold became unbearable. The surface looked calm, but the temperature was near freezing, just above 40, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. According to Army medical notes, hypothermia could set in within 10 minutes. They lasted 5. The first collapse happened halfway through. A woman with cropped blonde hair, maybe 20 years old, swayed, her knees giving way. Collins shouted for a medic. The sergeant hesitated, then waved him forward. The medic sprinted down the embankment, boots sliding in the mud. "Get her out!" he yelled, voice echoing off the river. Ingrid stared as the woman was dragged from the water, her lips blue, body limp. For a second, even the guards seemed shaken. The laughter from earlier was gone. The scene had shifted from punishment to something else, something ugly neither side could name. One of the older women muttered, "Even our captors begin to look ashamed." It wasn't victory, just observation. The guard who had barked orders all morning now stood silent, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ground. As the medic wrapped the fainted woman in a blanket, his hands trembled. He scribbled a note on his clipboard, something about unnecessary exposure. Collins caught the glance between them, a quiet acknowledgement that something here was wrong. Ingrid watched as the medic's pen scratched against paper. For the first time, someone was documenting their suffering. And though she didn't know it yet, that small act of record-keeping would matter later if it survived. The medic's name was Corporal James Decker, 20, 3 years old, Brooklyn accent, and a habit of writing everything down. His notebook was damp, the ink running, but his conscience stayed clear. That morning, he'd watched the so-called sanitation procedure spiral into something he couldn't defend. So he wrote, "Unnecessary exposure, risk of hypothermia, morale impact severe." It was a simple line, but it carried weight. Decker moved quietly among the women, handing out thin wool blankets that smelled of gasoline. He didn't meet their eyes at first, afraid of what he might see reflected there. Around him the camp buzzed with forced order. Officers barking logistics, trucks reversing, papers shuffled to bury discomfort under protocol. Hygiene check complete. A lieutenant muttered, stamping the form like it erased the screams. Ingrid sat against a wooden post, her hands trembling too violently to hold her blanket steady. Decker knelt beside her, offered a canteen, and said softly, "Drink slow." She looked up, confused enemy yet kind. For a moment neither spoke. The river wind filled the silence. He wanted to say sorry but couldn't. Instead, he wrote it later in his report margins. Saw them as human. Feels wrong to stay silent. According to internal audits released years later, Red Cross observers would flag violations of humane treatment in several temporary camps across Western Germany. The 1946 review confirmed what Decker felt that day. The line between order and abuse had blurred beyond recognition. When he turned the report in, his superior barely glanced at it. "File it under medical," the captain said, dropping it onto a stack of untouched papers. Decker hesitated. "Sir, these are women. This isn't procedure." The captain's reply was as cold as the river. "Procedure is what I say it is." That night, Decker watched the papers vanish into bureaucracy, filed away under hygiene compliance. But one copy he kept for himself, tucked inside his field manual, hidden beneath pages of dosage charts. Ingrid never knew it existed. As dawn crept over the camp, she saw Decker once more, standing by the trucks, eyes hollow but steady. She realized someone had noticed the smallest spark of decency, surviving in the machinery of victory. But the machine kept running, and new orders were already on the way. By the next morning, Decker's quiet note had traveled up the wrong chain of command. A clerk in the camp office stamped it reviewed, and slid it onto the commander's desk. A man named Major Franklin, square, jawed, exhausted, and buried under paperwork. He skimmed the report, sighed, and muttered, "We can't afford softness." Then, with one sweep of his pen, he issued new standing orders. Discipline and hygiene procedures remain mandatory. Inside the command tent, typewriters clacked like distant gunfire. Coffee cups trembled on steel desks as officers dictated memos over the rumble of approaching convoys. Franklin's assistant, a second lieutenant barely 30, hesitated before reading the draft aloud. "Sir, this line, mandatory public bathing, maybe we should reword." The major cut him off. "Reword nothing. The brass wants order. We give them order." Outside, the camp pulsed with uneasy rhythm. Over 1,000 temporary POW camps had sprung up across Allied, occupied Germany by April of 1945. Supplies were stretched, tempers thinner than ration soup. Every directive from above was treated like gospel, even when it clashed with conscience. Franklin wasn't cruel, just mechanical, another cog trying to make sense of chaos. Ingrid and the others didn't know his name, only the ripple of consequences that followed his signature. Guards received the new memo by noon, repeat sanitation as needed, maintain discipline, no exceptions. To the soldiers, it sounded like routine. To the women, it meant another day of humiliation. That afternoon, as trucks rumbled past carrying crates of rations, Franklin stared at the Rhine through a slit in his tent. The sun cut across the muddy water like a blade of glass. He whispered to himself, "We keep them clean, we keep control." But deep down, he knew this wasn't about disease. It was about dominance. Decker, meanwhile, noticed his report missing. When he asked, the clerk shrugged. "Filed somewhere, doesn't matter. That phrase, doesn't matter. Hit harder than any order." He knew then that silence wasn't just a choice. It was policy. And soon, those same orders would travel outward, to camps miles away, carried by couriers and carbon copies, spreading a procedure no one dared question. The memo didn't stop at Remagen. Within days, carbon copies traveled along the Allied logistics chain, filed, stamped, and retyped in camps stretching from Rheinberg to Bad Kreuznach. Standard sanitation, the heading read, but behind those sterile words hid something colder. Orders flowed faster than questions, and soldiers obeyed before asking why. By late April of 1945, the Rhine corridor had become a network of makeshift cages, open-air camps, where tens of thousands of German POW waited under the spring rain. Among them, at least 16,000 were women, most auxiliary staff or nurses caught in retreat. Records listed them simply as non-combatant personnel. In practice, they were treated as bargaining chips between logistics and revenge. At Rheinberg, a sergeant from the 2nd Infantry copied Remagen's template exactly. The same public bathing routine. The same rationale, delousing, hygiene, control, and once again, laughter mixed with silence as uniforms burned. The ground turned slick with mud and soap, the air thick with diesel and humiliation. Each camp had its own rhythm of cruelty, some methodical, others careless. In Bad Kreuznach, one lieutenant tried to justify it to a chaplain. "We treat them no worse than they treated our boys." The chaplain's reply was simple, "That's not the point." But his protest never left the tent. Letters between officers show a chilling bureaucratic detachment. Recommend consistent hygiene policy across all Rhine facilities. One memo reads, another adds, morale among guards improves when routine is maintained. They measured morale, not mercy. From her corner of the camp, Ingrid began to notice new faces, women from other regions, their accents foreign even to fellow prisoners. They shared the same story: forced washing, burned clothing, public shame. Each time, the same excuse. Hygiene, it became the most misused word in the war's final weeks. One guard, while handing out rations, muttered, "Our dignity was rationed like bread." It was a joke, bitter but true. Even the men enforcing the orders could feel the rot underneath. Yet the machine kept rolling, grinding empathy into regulation. Somewhere down the river, a rumor began. Someone outside the camps was asking questions, a journalist, a civilian with a notebook, and for the first time the story threatened to escape the wire. He arrived unannounced, an American war correspondent named Alan Monroe, carrying a dented typewriter, 2 notebooks, and the permission slip that said temporary press access. He'd heard whispers in the officers' tent about sanitation drills. That didn't sound like hygiene. The phrase, female POW, had caught his attention. "I want to see for myself," he'd told the press officer. The man smirked. "You won't find a story here, just mud and discipline." But Monroe found plenty. At Rainburg Camp, the air smelled of smoke and disinfectant, the kind that burned the nose. He wrote in his notes, faces gray, bodies shaking, routine feels rehearsed. The guards avoided eye contact, their laughter brittle, hollow. Through his camera's viewfinder, he saw the scene blur women lined up near the river, mist curling around them like fog from a nightmare. He didn't click the shutter, not once. "I don't want proof," he muttered. "I want truth." Later, inside the camp office, he confronted the lieutenant in charge. "Is this protocol?" he asked, voice steady but sharp. The officer replied flatly, "This is hygiene." Monroe pressed again. Then, why, the audience, silence. Only the typewriter keys answered, clacking like distant gunfire. In his notebook that night, Monroe wrote, "They looked like ghosts, gray against gray. One woman stared at me, and I couldn't breathe." He called them the gray ghosts of the Rhine. But when his report reached the Allied Press Bureau, half of it vanished in red ink. Lines like humiliation, disguised as hygiene, and moral erosion in victory were struck out. Official reason compromises public image. Out of 200 field reports filed that spring, barely 2% were ever declassified before the 1950s. Monroe's wasn't one of them. His editor back in London sent a curt cable, "Great writing, unprintable." He left the camp the next morning, mud clinging to his boots, camera untouched. Ingrid saw him pass through the wire gate, head down, shoulders heavy. She didn't know who he was, but she recognized the look in his eyes. Shame wasn't one, sided Enamore. And even though his words were buried, his visit would echo through whispers that would soon turn into letters. When the reporter disappeared down the muddy road, silence settled again, but something had changed. The women began to whisper about getting their voices out, somehow, anywhere. A few of them had scraps of paper hidden inside their boots, cigarette wrappers, ration slips, pages torn from manuals. Ink was made from crushed berries, soot, or diluted mud. They wrote anyway. Words became their only weapon. Ingrid's first letter started small, "We are alive." Then she added, "They make us bathe in front of them. They burn what we wear." Her handwriting shook with cold and fear, but she pressed harder, determined not to fade. The letters had to pass through the guards for censorship, each one limited to 25 lines, nothing political. So she wrote between the lines, literally phrases angled, words tucked into the margins. She wasn't alone. Dozens of women did the same, smuggling fragments through laundry bags or bribing sympathetic clerks. One guard even risked slipping a folded note into a Red Cross convoy crate, saying quietly, "No one should be treated like this." That note would reach Geneva weeks later. The letters carried everything: shame, anger, fragments of prayer. One read, "I washed, but the shame won't leave." Another, "We are not soldiers. Why do they hate us this way?" Each message was both confession and evidence. According to Allied postal records, thousands of POW letters were censored during the spring of 1945. Most were reduced to fragments, sanitized like the camps themselves, but a few slipped through untouched, spreading quietly across Europe. Ingrid's own letter traveled farther than she expected. Weeks later, it reached a Red Cross field worker stationed near Frankfurt. The woman reading it paused halfway, tears smudging the ink. She didn't need translation to understand what the lines meant. The phrase river bath appeared 4 times, each one colder than the last. Back at the Rhine, Ingrid sat in the dirt, unaware that her words were moving. The guards still barked orders, the trucks still roared, but the silence between those sounds had changed. It carried something new, evidence, and soon that evidence would draw visitors wearing armbands marked with a red cross, clipboards ready, and eyes that didn't yet know what they were about to see. They arrived without warning, 2 men and 1 woman in gray coats, marked with the unmistakable red cross. Their jeep rolled through the camp gate under a pale morning sun, wheels crunching over gravel. Guards straightened up, officers adjusted caps, and suddenly everyone remembered what procedure was supposed to look like. The Red Cross inspectors were polite but sharp. They didn't shout, didn't accuse. They just looked. The female inspector, a Swiss woman named Marion Vogel, carried a clipboard stacked with blank forms. Her first question landed softly. "Where are the female prisoners being held?" The major hesitated, clearing his throat. "Temporary section near the river. Routine hygiene." That word again, hygiene. When Vogel and her team reached the riverbank, the sight stopped them cold. Thin blankets clung to shivering bodies. Uniforms smoldered in a barrel nearby, and the air smelled of ash and wet wool. Marion's pencil froze halfway down her page. She had seen suffering before, but not this kind, not public, not defended as sanitary necessity. Her report would later summarize the moment in 2 restrained lines. Irregular procedure observed. POW exposure inconsistent with Geneva Convention, Article 13. It sounded clinical, but those words carried weight. Article 13 was explicit. Prisoners must be protected from insults and public curiosity. She asked for the camp commander. Major Franklin appeared, his uniform immaculate, eyes calculating. "Your concern is noted," he said smoothly, "but the war has left us limited options." Marion pressed on. "Options do not erase dignity." He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Noted," he repeated. For 2 hours, the inspectors walked through the camp, taking silent inventory. Barbed wire, muddy tents, hollow eyes. Each detail etched into their notes. When they finally left, the soldiers exhaled in relief. But Ingrid watched the jeep drive away and whispered. They nodded, wrote, and vanished. Back in Geneva, those notes joined hundreds of other reports waiting in a file labeled pending review. Bureaucracy would smother outrage once again. Yet, unseen by anyone at the camp, 1 page carried a faint thumbprint in the corner. Marion's, pressed into damp ink. A human mark in an inhuman process. The system had noticed, but not acted. For the women in the mud, awareness meant nothing without intervention. The war ended, but the shame didn't. For many of the women, liberation felt like another kind of imprisonment, memories locked inside skin that wouldn't forget. In the years after 1945, they returned to shattered towns and hollow homes, carrying secrets they couldn't speak aloud. Germany had no space for their kind of story. To most, they were lucky to be alive, but luck had a bitter taste. In 1948, researchers from a rehabilitation institute in Munich began quietly interviewing former female POW. Their reports used careful words: persistent anxiety, recurring nightmares, dissociative episodes. Between the lines, you could read what they couldn't print: trauma that rotted from the inside out. One transcript recorded Frau Ingrid S., once a radio operator, saying simply, "We stopped feeling like women. Nightmares came often. They'd wake in sweat, hearing phantom orders a strip, now, echoing through sleep." Others described the sound of boots on gravel or the cold slap of river water that never warmed. Even marriage couldn't erase it. Husbands didn't understand why their wives froze at the sound of a whistle or refused to bathe with the door unlocked. Psychologists later estimated that nearly 40% of surviving German female POW suffered long-term anxiety or depressive illness. Most never sought help. Silence became their survival. Ingrid worked as a telegraph clerk after the war. Her hands never stopped shaking, so she learned to type faster, to drown the tremor in rhythm, but whenever she washed her hands, she'd pause, staring at the sink as if expecting orders again. Once she wrote in a private diary, "Clean water feels like punishment." Decker's old report would resurface years later, validating everything those women had endured. But in the immediate aftermath, the world wanted stories of heroism, not humiliation. The Allies built memorials, Germany built excuses. The women built silence. One survivor summarized it best during a late interview. It wasn't the coal, it was the eyes. Those eyes, the guards, the officers, even their own reflections became prisons that followed them long after the wire came down. And while most buried the past, others found themselves dragged back into it during post, or interrogations called to testify, to explain, to relive. For them, survival meant reopening the wound. By 1946, the story of the Rhine camps had begun to leak quietly through letters, diaries, and rumors. But when journalists asked questions, officials answered with one phrase: enemy propaganda. The U.S. administration, eager to preserve the moral clarity of victory, refused to acknowledge anything resembling abuse. "We treated them humanely," one spokesman declared at a press briefing in Frankfurt, his tone rehearsed, his eyes fixed on the floor. Behind the microphones, truth was being filed away. Reports like Corporal Decker's and Marion Vogel's Red Cross memos were relabeled sensitive. Only 7 out of more than 200 complaints were ever officially acknowledged. The rest vanished into what military clerks called administrative fog. The press followed the tone set from above. Editors preferred headlines about rebuilding Europe, not moral contradictions. Monroe, the war correspondent who had once walked the mud of Rheinberg, sent another draft titled "The Clean War Myth." It came back stamped rejected. His editor's note read, "Focus on reconstruction. Readers want hope, not guilt." Ingrid, like thousands of other former POW, heard the silence echo louder than any denial. In her village, people spoke about rations, not rivers. She'd catch fragments of radio broadcasts praising Allied generosity, and her stomach would twist. The humiliation that had been public was now being erased publicly. Official inquiries framed the bathing incidents as isolated oversights or unverified testimonies. Even sympathetic officers downplayed them. One colonel wrote in a private letter, "Our men were tired. Mistakes happen." The sentence carried the cold precision of bureaucracy, the kind that kills empathy one memo at a time. When Decker's report resurfaced briefly during an internal review, a staff officer scrawled across it in red pencil, "Not for release, potential political harm." The same handwriting marked Vogel's inspection file. Truth was now a liability. For the women, it felt like the second defeat. First their bodies stripped, now their memories. "They erased our humiliation with paperwork," Ingrid told a friend decades later, "but documents have a way of surviving denial." Deep in archives across Washington, London, and Geneva, dusty folders waited for light. And in the 1990s, that light would finally break through. Because one historian refused to accept the phrase "case closed." It began in the 1990s inside a windowless archive in Washington, D.C. The historian's name was Dr. Helen Krauss German, born American citizen, relentless about details. She wasn't looking for scandal. She was tracing POW camp logistics for her doctoral research. But in a stack labeled Rhine operations, sanitation protocols, she found something that didn't belong. A faded carbon copy marked Confidential Hygiene Compliance, Remagen. The pages smelled of mildew and thyme. In between routine reports about rations and disease control, she found Decker's name and his note. Unnecessary exposure, risk of hypothermia, morale impact severe. Her breath caught. Then came another sheet, the Red Cross inspection memo signed by Marion Vogel. Krauss froze. Irregular procedure observed. Article 13 conflict. These were the ghosts that history had buried under tidy euphemisms. For weeks, Krauss combed through storage boxes stacked like tombstones. Some documents were burned at the edges, others stamped secret. She pieced together fragments, typed reports, marginalia, coded memos, all describing the same hygiene measures. At multiple camps along the Rhine, she found references to photographs to official U.S. Army Signal Corps images marked restricted. There were nearly 1,700 photos catalogued. Most were mundane tents, trucks, supply lines, but a handful labeled female POW processing Western sector made her stop. The women's faces were blurred, but the posture, the setting, the river, it all matched the reports. Proof at last. In her journal, Krauss wrote, "The evidence was never lost, just buried under comfort." When she published her findings in a small academic journal in 1994, it caused quiet chaos. Military historians argued, politicians dismissed, and survivors wept. The proof was there, she said during an interview, just not convenient. Suddenly, archives across Europe began unlocking their own files. Geneva released previously sealed Red Cross logs. London opened Allied field correspondence. Each folder confirmed what rumor had carried for decades. The phrase sanitation procedure would never sound the same again. But Krauss wanted more than paper. She wanted voices. And so she began tracking survivors' women who had lived through those riverside mornings. Decades old, hidden behind ordinary lives, they still remembered everything. One by one, they began to speak. They found them scattered across Europe, old women in quiet towns, their wartime faces hidden behind wrinkles and silence. When Dr. Helen Krauss began filming interviews in the early 2000s, the youngest of them was already in her 80s. Some spoke in whispers, others refused to meet the camera's eye. But once the tape began rolling, decades of silence broke like a dam. Ingrid was among them, her hair white, her voice fragile but steady. She sat by a window in Bremen, the afternoon light soft against lace curtains. The first question was simple. What do you remember of the river? She closed her eyes. Cold, she said, and the sound of laughter that wasn't joy. Then slowly the rest came. Krauss's recordings captured Tremor's hands shaking mid-sentence, long pauses before words like naked, orders, and shame. Each confession carried the weight of a country that had tried to forget them. One woman said, "We weren't soldiers. We were reminders." The footage was raw, unfiltered. No swelling music, no narration, just truth, grainy and unflinching. In total, 12 survivors agreed to speak on camera. Their testimonies aligned with archived memos, with Decker's report, with Vogel's inspection. It was no longer rumor, it was record. When excerpts premiered at a historical conference in Berlin, the room went silent. Scholars shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered that it complicated the narrative. Others called it overdue. The German press dubbed them Die Vergesessenen Frauen, the forgotten women. Even after the session ended, Krauss couldn't shake one moment. Ingrid had reached for a photograph on the table, a faded print of the camp. the river behind, the guards barely visible in mist. She held it up to the camera and said softly, "That's me, second from the left." The room went still. By the time the documentary aired in 2012, most of the women had passed away. Their voices lived on in black and white frames, trembling yet undeniable. Krauss ended her narration with one line she hadn't planned to write. "History doesn't ask for forgiveness. It asks to be seen." And in that final shot, Ingrid's photograph lingered on screen, her eyes meeting the viewers, daring history to look back. The photo still hangs in the Berlin Memorial Archive, faded, grain-speckled, edges curled from time. Ingrid's eyes stare out from it, neither pleading nor defiant, just steady. Visitors pause, unsure what to feel. Some whisper that it can't be true. Others read the caption twice. Female POW, Rhine Camp, March 1945. The war, they realize, didn't end neatly. It leaked into memory, into guilt, into generations. 7 decades after those riverbanks froze with shame, scholars still debate responsibility. Was it command failure, field improvisation, or moral blindness disguised as procedure? Numbers shift between reports, hundreds here, thousands there, but the truth refuses to be rounded down. Cleanliness, the word once used to justify humiliation, became a stain history couldn't wash out. Modern historians now teach the Rhine camps as moral fault lines of victory. They cite Krauss's work, Decker's buried notes, Vogel's forgotten signature. Each document, each voice, is a reminder that even the good wars leave shadows. One archive director put it bluntly, "Every triumph hides its cost." For survivors like Ingrid, reckoning didn't come from apologies. It came from acknowledgement. When the documentary aired, a letter arrived from a retired American veteran. It said only, "I was their substitute that never truly satisfies. I turned away. I'm sorry. No return address." That single line closed a circle history had left open for 70 years. Outside the museum, school groups file past the glass displays, their voices low. The photo stands near a small plaque engraved with just 4 words, "Remember what victory costs." Ingrid died in 2014. Her ashes were scattered along the Rhine, the same river that had once stripped her dignity, now carried her memory onward. For the first time, her story flowed freely, no longer trapped behind wire or silence. History didn't wash it away. It revealed it, and in that revelation lies the warning. Cruelty rarely announces itself with violence. It often wears the calm face of routine, the paperwork of order, the language of hygiene. The water looks clean, the stain remains.